Thank you very much. My name is Duncan Scott, and I produced the original authorized version of the film that Ayn Rand authorized, roughly starting around 1970. And then more recently, I've produced this new restored version, which will be shown tonight in a special sneak preview. Without being overdramatic, it's really a miracle that this film is here at all. I'll be telling you about the many eventful and dramatic circumstances that the film went through, and about the many heroes who were involved in saving the film and making sure it didn't disappear forever. Let me give you a little taste of what I'll be talking about. For starters, the film was opposed by very powerful government forces in Italy, where it was made in 1942. It then went ahead and was made without authorization from Ayn Rand. In fact, she didn't even have any awareness that the film was being made at all, and only found out after the war and only saw the film for the first time a number of years after the war. It was filmed under very difficult wartime conditions that really limited how a film could be made. It had controversial scenes that had to be hidden from government authorities. But still in all, it became the biggest grossing film in Italy of 1942. And that is especially extraordinary because the movie was banned at the height of its initial run. So it never even got to finish its initial run, and it still became the biggest grossing film in Italy. A very significant part of the story is that the themes and the scenes in the movie rallied resistance to the fascist government running Italy at the time. And as you can imagine, that didn't go over too well. After it was banned, Mussolini ordered that all the prints and the negatives be confiscated and destroyed. And so at that point, it looked like this was going to be definitely the end for this movie. Fortunately, there were heroes that stepped up right at that point, taking some very risky action, and I'll get into that when we get to that part of the story. Then the film was lost for decades. After being hidden, after the war, it was not hidden, but then for a variety of reasons, the film became lost. Decades went by, and then it was finally rediscovered. And again, some heroic actions took place at that point. So my part in the long We the Living journey started when I was a very young man. It began while I was working alongside Ayn Rand to create this new authorized version of the film. And that was 53 years ago. And you know what? The work still isn't done. It's still ongoing. There's still more we're going to do with this film. I wanted to ask a question before we go much further. I've had some discussion with my colleagues about how many people have actually seen We the Living in its current unrestored version. Well, let me put the question another way. Thank you for being quick with your hands. How many people have not ever seen We the Living in any version? Okay, pretty fair number. Well, I'm happy to say, before I get into my talk, I'd like to show you a few scenes from the film. It'll give you a better sense of what we're talking about. So go ahead and run that video.
Bisogna essere pratici ai giorni nostri. Kira, i tasti della macchina da scrivere sono i primi gradini per salire in alto.
Beh, basta con queste storie.
Ma Kira, non ti interessa questa discussione?
Mi interessa, ma per me è superflua. Studierò. Voglio diventare ingegnere.
Allora verrai all'istituto tecnologico con me. Costruirai anche tu per lo Stato Rosso.
Costruirò perché mi piace. È l'unica professione che mi consentirà di non dire menzogne. I numeri sono numeri. E l'acciaio è acciaio.
Ingegnere. Ma ti pare una professione adatta per una donna?
Bambino. Ma cosa vuoi fare nella Russia sovietica?
Questo dipenderà da me. Voglio costruire palazzi, grattacieli, d'acciaio e di vetro. È un gran ponte, tutto d'alluminio, bianco, luminoso, il ponte più bello del mondo.
Dio. Il tuo ponte è molto bello. È come un sogno. Ma non ci sono sponde per appoggiarlo. E puoi costruire per che cosa? Per chi? Non si può costruire dove non si può nemmeno vivere.
Quando tutto sarà passato e le tracce del bolscevismo saranno state disinfettate dalla storia, quest'inno sarà una magnifica marcia funebre. La marcia funebre dell'illusione rossa.
Sciocca. Cosa state dicendo?
Quanto vi pagano per andare in giro a spiare?
Lo sapete qual è il posto per le ragazze come voi?
Sì, dove uomini come voi non potrebbero entrare nemmeno dalla porta di servizio.
Vedo che siete nuova qui. Dovreste essere più prudente.
Abito al quarto piano e le scale sono rotte e sdrucciolevoli. Siate prudente voi quando verrete ad arrestarmi.
Ma siete coraggiosa o solamente stupida?
Lascio a voi di scoprirlo.
Che hai fatto? Quello è della GPU, è uno dei membri più influenti.
Me ne vado. Sì, me ne vado per sempre.
Leo.
Devo lasciare la Russia prima che mi trovi. Parto stanotte con un battello che fa il contrabbando. Contrabbando di carne umana. Fuori da questa trappola di lupi e di anime disperate. Se non ci prendono raggiungeremo la Germania. E se no è la sentenza di morte per tutti.
Vengo con te.
Sai cosa stiamo abbandonando? Una galera, Kisa. Un'immensa galera coperta di neve e macchiata di sangue. Dove si è condannato a soffrire per scontare una sola pena. Quella di aver avuto la sfortuna di nascere. Liberi. Saremo liberi.
Io non sapevo.
Non volevo che sapeste. Ho cercato di starvi lontano e di vincermi. Ho anche pensato che avrei potuto arrestarvi, portarvi dove volevo e prendervi. Non sapete quello che avete fatto di me. Giorni fa ho perquisito una casa, c'era una donna. Le abbiamo trovato addosso dei documenti. Si dibatteva sul pavimento nella sua camicia da notte chiedendo grazia. Ho pensato a voi lì, sul pavimento, nella vostra camicia da notte, chiedendo pietà, come io ne ho chiesto a voi per tanti mesi. Ebbene, le risi in faccia e le diedi un calcio. Perché mi guardate così?
Andrei.
niente da offrirvi, neanche la mia vita.
E dove l'hai presa?
Da un contrabbandiere.
E tu? Tu compri di contrabbando?
E perché no? Sapevo che ti sarebbe piaciuta.
No, un tempo non avresti mai fatto una cosa simile.
Un tempo, ma forse ora tutto è diverso. Ebbene, ti piace?
Ma davvero all'estero portano della biancheria nera? Che cosa assurda. È bella.
Forse le cose più assurde sono le più belle.
Se ti vedessero i tuoi compagni della GPU?
Kila, ti piacerebbe andare all'estero?
Che cosa hai detto?
Sì. Prima mi sembrava una cosa assurda, ma adesso sto pensando che a questo. Andarcene. Io e te soli per sempre.
There are a lot of heroes, as I said, that were responsible in saving this movie and making it possible to all of us to be here tonight to watch it. And of course, first and foremost is Ayn Rand herself. The movie's based on her novel, and I would call it heroic in that she wrote this novel. She very clearly laid out the evils of communism during the Red Decade when nobody wanted to hear it. And the book faced a lot of rejection, eventually did get published, but critics were dismissive. And of course it was her first novel, and you can imagine what that meant to her. It's also very important to note that unlike any of her other novels, it was very personal. It was drawn very heavily from her own life experiences. And in fact, she later wrote that it was as close to an autobiography as I will ever write. And that's also something to keep in mind when you see what people did with the property and her lack of involvement in the movie when it was initially made. So, one more thing to say about her version of the book. I'm amazed by her grasp of, her mastery of English at this early point and having come to America. And you must read the book. If you've only read Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, you have to add We the Living to it. It's very different than those novels. I would describe it as the most heartfelt novel that she's ever written. Not to say that that's not a component of her other novels, but you definitely get the sense of drawing from things that impacted her very personally early in her life. It also has one of the most remarkable sections of writing that I've ever seen, which is at the end of the novel. I can't say too much about it without it being a spoiler for those who don't know the living story. But the final chapter really captures the main character, Kira's sense of life in the most profound and deepest and most beautiful way. I've always been blown away by that final chapter, so you definitely owe it to yourself to read the novel. So it was published around 1936. It was not very successful. Over the entire, I think, 18 months, they printed 3,000 copies, and they eventually sold them out. The publisher didn't, they reused the type. They basically destroyed the typeset, so there was no way to go into a second edition. Ayn Rand earned a big $100 from that initial release of the book, but the book did better in other countries. This is the Italian version, published not long after the American. It also did well in England and Denmark, from what I understand. The Italian readers really took to it. I think probably for the same reasons that I'll talk about why they took to the movie. One of the readers of the book was the daughter of a man that ran a film studio. His name was Michel Scalera. I don't have the daughter's exact name, but she loved the book. And you would think if she got this notion that the book would make a great movie, she would run to her father and say, you know, Dad, you should make a movie out of this. But she felt that he might not, he was, you know, being another generation, he might not understand it the way she did. And she went to the general manager of the studio, a man named Massimo Ferrara, who also plays a very significant role in saving the movie later on, and basically said, you're young, you know, you take it to him and convince them to make a movie out of it. So that's basically the beginnings of the idea to make a movie of it. A very big complication of making movies in Italy was that the fascists controlled Italy, and they controlled every industry, including the movie industry. So everything had to be approved by the fascists. Everything was overseen by the fascists. And this, I think, led to a really amazing irony that someone had to advocate for making this movie with the fascists. It was already recognized that the storyline and the themes were controversial, but the movie wouldn't have been made if somebody didn't step up and say, you know, we got to do this movie. So this was a gigantic irony that the person who stepped up was this man, who happens to be, his name is Vittorio, and his last name is Mussolini. He was the son of the dictator, Benito Mussolini, and I don't know whether to say an aspiring filmmaker or wannabe filmmaker or early in his career filmmaker. He did have some credits. And We the Living would not have been made if he hadn't interceded and said, yeah, the storyline's controversial, but it'll be fine. We got to make this movie. He was, this is the Mussolini men, but the dictator in the middle and Vittorio on the right. And so the approval was granted for the movie to be made. He loved being in the movie business and got to meet celebrities and so forth. So then we get to a big problem. They decide they want to make the movie, and then normally the next thing you would do is get the literary rights to the property. But Ayn Rand was an American. Italy was at war with America. There was really no legal channel to use to get the literary rights. And so really what the producers should have done is say, well, we can't do this movie now. We'll have to pick something else to do. But instead, they basically decided to steal it. They would just go ahead and do the movie, and the war was on, and we'd just sort of see the consequences and figure things out after the war. I spoke with this man, Anton Majano, in the late 80s. And by the way, I got a lot of the details about We the Living from this man, from Rossano Brazzi, one of the stars of the movie, and the Massimo Ferrara, who I interviewed in the late 80s, who was the head of the studio. All three of them were just very intimately involved in everything that happened in the movie, making of the movie, and it was a gold mine for getting information. So Mujano here said very bluntly, we cheated. We stole the property and we went ahead to make it. And we began all the elaborate preparations for making the film. It's an epic film, a very large scale. In fact, it turned out to be the largest scale movie ever made in Italy up to that time. Cast were the leading stars of Italy. All three of the major players were huge stars in Italy. Vasco Giacchetti is not a name that's well known here, but he was very big in Italy. He was kind of the John Wayne of Italy, virile and tough, but yet he could be very sympathetic, as you'll see in We the Living. In fact, I would say he really breaks your heart by the end of the movie. And this is Rossano Brazzi, also a big leading man by that time. He mostly had done swashbuckling parts. We the Living was very important to him, he told me, because it established him as a serious actor. And he was very good in it. He has the very difficult challenge of a character arc that goes from being very sympathetic to getting bitter and disillusioned and rejectful of everything going on by the end. It's quite an arc, character arc for him to travel, and he did an amazing job. He did many, many movies over the years, and a few in English that some of you of a certain age might be familiar with. Three Coins in the Fountain, and this one, South Pacific, the musical. So he was a pretty well-known figure in America, the late 50s through the 60s, and then his American phase of his career kind of faded away. In my interview with him, he said he loved playing the character of Leo, that he was a nice, good son of a bitch. The other interesting thing about him is he's been so iconic in the Italian film industry, and yet nobody had written a biography of him. And my executive producer, Lynn Florkowitz, saw that situation, and she has written a biography that will be coming out soon, a full book-length biography, which is going to be fascinating because Brazzi was involved with the Italian resistance even during the filming of We the Living. And after We the Living, he completely quit the movie industry and was in the full-time in the resistance. He was arrested a number of times. He faced a firing squad a number of times. Definitely a huge hero and a brilliant performance in this film. And finally, Alida Valli, who's the heart and soul of the movie. She too was an icon of Italian film industry. Her career lasted many, many decades. I've seen a number of other films that she's been in, and I would argue that We the Living and the part of Kira was the most demanding part that she ever had, and she was amazing in it. Also a range of emotions and feelings that had to be portrayed, and power and passion, and it was all there. And her career went on right through the 1990s. I spoke with her briefly and got some background on that. She was very, very popular in Italy, constantly doing interviews on the cover of fan magazines. A few English language films. One of the ones that is a must-see is The Third Man. It's a classic film. If you haven't seen it, you owe it to yourself to seek that out. It was a British film with Orson Welles and Joseph Cotten. Very, very memorable film. She also did a film for Hitchcock and a few other American films, but then she went back to Italy, and the rest of her career was basically in Europe. So at this point, We the Living was set to go into production. It had an all-star cast. The proportions were really epic. This was a period film set in Russia. They had to recreate St. Petersburg on sound stages in Rome. But it was all really good to go except for one problem. These two guys. They were assigned to write the screenplay. And they, in addition to not being screenplay writers, they were kind of in the literary realm in Italy, highfalutin end of it, not so much dealing with a film adaptation. And It was considered very prestigious that they were hired to do the screenplay, but they got very creative in not a good way. I'll just give you one example. In We the Living, Kira aspires to be an engineer, and you'll see in the movie she says things like steel is steel, and it's the only profession where I don't have to lie. These writers decided they would make her a ballerina. And then there was a lot more like that. Fortunately, the director stepped in. He had been working on another movie in another country. When he came back, he looked at the script and said, this is impossible. We're not even going to have these guys rewrite the script. We're just going to throw this out and start over from scratch. The only problem is they had to go into production right away. The sets were built, the cast and the crew were hired, everything was in place. There was too much momentum in making a movie of that size to stop and wait for a new script to be written. So what to do? Again, this gentleman I mentioned before, who was an assistant director, this is sort of a strange assignment to get, but he was assigned to start writing the dialogue. And the only way this was going to work, that they could proceed, is for him to write pages of dialogue as they were filming. And in many cases, the actors only got their scripts a couple of days or even a day before they were supposed to film it. I mean, the technicians and the set builders and everything, they knew what scenes were coming up, but the dialogue was being written really just before things were happening. But that turns out to be a good thing, because he was drawing from the book, and there was no time to be creative. And the book and the movie was therefore much, much more faithful to the book. He's there flipping through pages, writing the dialogue, adapting it in ways that you have to for a movie, but basically sticking to the book. And that's something you rarely ever see when books are adapted for the screen. So with that in place, now filming for We the Living could begin. And so here we had, just to summarize the situation, this movie's going into production it's a huge movie in Italy, huge, all-star cast, big budget. It'll end up being the longest running movie in Italy to that time. Ayn Rand had not given permission. No participation, no payment, and was totally unaware that the movie was even being made. And this I find incredibly ironic, given that it was basically autobiographical. It was her life, that she had no involvement whatsoever. The movie was filmed in the Cinecittà studios in Rome. They were very prestigious film center, kind of like how we would think of Universal Studios or some other big studio in Hollywood. They made tremendous movies before the Italian movie industry kind of declined over the years. But even some big American films, or films that American companies participated in, this epic version of Cleopatra with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, it was all filmed at Cinecittà. But We the Living was filmed, the war was going on. The war was raging. In fact, there were very few films made after We the Living because the war was just taking over everything. There was no possibility of filming on location, and so everything about the movie, which is all set in St. Petersburg, Russia, had to be recreated on sound stages in Rome, in the summer, no less. So a lot of things were created with miniatures. There weren't really a need for a whole lot of that in We the Living, but you'll see trains that are obviously not full-size trains, and some pretty elaborate sets with snowfall and winter scenes, all of these on a sound stage in the middle of Rome, Italy, in the middle of the summer. And Rossano Brazzi said this was one of the hardest things about playing the part, is they were roasting to death and they had to act like they were freezing. But it worked. It comes across beautifully. There's a scene with a horse-drawn sleigh in the snow. It looks like it's outside. It was really quite an accomplishment what they did. One of the things that added to the authenticity of the film is that there were a lot of Russian expatriates living in Rome at that time, and they used them to the max in this film. There are so many extras in this film. Keep an eye out for scenes with crowds of people. There are just gazillions of them. And many, many of them were actual Russian expatriates. And also the production designers who worked on the sets, the banners and slogans and things that you'll see on the walls. There were expatriate Russians who were there as creative consultants or designers on the movie. So one of the problems with having a script being written as you go along is it's very hard to gauge how long that you're hitting the right length for the movie overall. And in fact, they began shooting more and more material and realized that it couldn't possibly fit into one movie. So the studio decided, well, we're going to release it as 2 films. And we're going to keep it a secret and not tell the actors. What could possibly go wrong with that? So it wasn't long before the actors realized what was up, and there was a bit of a, flurry of a fight over that. I think Rossano Brazzi and Alida Valli stopped working for a few days. And anyway, they came around, they were paid more for doing a second film, and they just proceeded that way. During the filming, because this was Italy and the industry's controlled by the fascists, they had to allow fascist authorities to come in and look at the footage that was filmed. And so there were frequent visits to the editing room, and the authorities would want to view the footage. They had a sense that this was always a hot potato of a film, and they had a sense that there could be scenes that could be very troublesome. And so they would come and the editors would show them, well, this is what we shot yesterday. But they would hold back some of the most controversial scenes, and they would kind of put those aside. And I'm told that once in a while the authorities would come and look at a few scenes and say, wait a minute, is that it? There has to be more. I mean, they knew that studios had to shoot a certain amount of footage, a number of minutes every day, and there was this a little game going on where the editors and the producers were hiding away the controversial scenes, and the authorities thought there's got to be more, and this went on for a while. This is the fascist headquarters in Rome, friendly-looking place. And that was headquarters for the Ministry of Film, the Ministry of Propaganda. All of these departments oversaw film production. And you can imagine what it was like making a movie with those kind of conditions. So you might wonder, what was controversial in the movie? And surprisingly, it's not so much speeches that the characters said, although that certainly does play a part of it. But really what was the big problem for the authorities were the social conditions that were depicted in the film. In this scene, Kira is trying to get medical help for Leo, who has a very serious condition and could die. And you'll see in the film a series of events where she tries to get help for him. That was a very controversial scene for the fascist authorities because there were similar things going on in Italy. And also Leo looking for a job. And he's told, he's asked, are you a party member? And he said, no, I'm not a party. Well, you can't get a job if you're not a party member. Are you in the union? No, well, you can't get a job unless you're in the union. Well, I can't get in the union unless I have a job. Well, and this catch-22, that was very prevalent in Italy as well. And that was something the fascists didn't like being portrayed at all. So the movie went on over the summer, and then they found out that it was going to be featured at the Venice Film Festival in September of 1942. And that was way earlier than they originally thought, and so they had to rush filming. There were 14-hour days typically of filming. The editors had to frantically put everything together. And just a few days before Venice, they started putting back in these controversial scenes that they had hidden away on other shelves. So the movie that did eventually play in Venice was the full movie with the controversial scenes, and it was sort of, we'll let the chips fall where they may now. These scenes have to be back in the film. Now this is the scene in the Piazza San Marco in Venice, Italy. If you've been to Venice, it's that huge square. And they had a huge outdoor screen, and as you see, many, many hundreds of people. It was an amazing setting to premiere a movie. And that happened in early September of 1942. And the movie got rave reviews overall. There were a few fascist associated reviewers and critics who panned it, but everyone else raved about it. It won at the festival something called the Volpi Cup, so it was quite a sensation. And then it went into release. And these are the two films that it was released as originally. Noi Vivi, which means We the Living, and Addio Cara, which means Goodbye Cara. And what viewers had to do, you had to go to the theater twice. You'd go to one theater, and in some cases, people would just run across town to where the other movie was playing and go to that theater and see the second film, or they'd come back another day to see the other film. So again, very remarkable for a movie to get the kind of box office it did with you having to jump through hoops like that to see it. So these are some of the early posters and advertising that came out. It created quite a phenomenon that's comparable if you know the story of Gone with the Wind here in America, which is the book everybody wanted to see made into a movie. Same was the case with Noi Vivi being made into a movie. Who would play the main parts? People would speculate endlessly about Gone with the Wind, same thing for We the Living. It was you can't exaggerate what a huge deal this was in Italy. And for reasons I'm going to explain in a moment, so much was resonating with the viewers. That too created a sensation around the film. Excuse me one second. The oppressive conditions that were depicted in the film were way too similar to what was going on in Italy. And if the authorities had thought more about what they were doing, they never would have let the film be released. But it was out there, it was a huge success, and the public was reacting to it. They had bread lines, they had unemployment, they had shortages, there was a lot of corruption in Italian government, just like is portrayed in the Russian government. Everything backfired as far as what the authorities thought. They thought, this is going to make Russia look bad. And Russia was their wartime enemy. But they didn't see it any deeper than that. And the similarities in any authoritarian or totalitarian regime were right there to be seen, but amazingly, nobody in the authorities picked up on it soon enough. The people would walk around the streets with buttons with the name of the film. There were people naming their kids Kira. It was that level of impact on the country. It came to be known as the film of nudging in the dark, and because people would be sitting in the theater and going, because that was their life. They were saying, that's our life, right up there on the screen. Several different people have said this was how the film was described, the film of nudging in the dark. So I was mentioning that people wore buttons and so forth. It was viewed as a sly indictment of the Mussolini regime without it being so direct. I mean, you could enjoy it and not worry about that you went to see the movie. So it was like the best of both worlds. The public was really enjoying sticking it to the Mussolini regime, and it was a really amazing movie to watch, and very powerful and enjoyable. So all that worked, but it all came to a screeching halt. The film was sent to some of the other Axis countries like Spain and eventually to Germany. And in Germany, Goebbels, on the far right there, who was Hitler's minister of propaganda, basically took one look at it and said, in effect, you guys in Italy, are you out of your minds? You have to pull this movie immediately. And of course, coming from Hitler's right-hand man, that got their attention. Mussolini ordered the films to all be removed from theaters, all the prints to be confiscated, and he ordered that all the negatives and other materials be confiscated as well and destroyed. There was to be nothing left of the film at this point. And so you might say, well, boy, is that it? Is that the end? And here again, another hero stepped in. Massimo Ferrara, who I mentioned before, took an extremely risky and bold move. He sent in the negatives of another film in the hope and the expectation that the authorities wouldn't run the film or look at it so carefully that they would realize that it wasn't We the Living. It was another film that they didn't value as highly as they did We the Living. And he went to one of the other production team members on We the Living and said, can you hide the negatives in your basement for the duration of the war? And that's exactly what happened. Who knows what would have happened to these guys had they been caught? I mean, you're dealing with Mussolini and fascists, and they were, no question disobeying direct orders from that dictator. So amazingly, the negatives were saved. They survived the war. And this is Massimo Ferrara. I interviewed him in the late 1980s. It was his idea to hide the negatives. Definitely, I think, a hero, and one of the people responsible for the fact that we're going to be watching the movie this evening. So movies were stored in the basement. The war came to its conclusion. But then the studio, Scalera Film, a few years after the war, went out of business. They had been very successful, but for whatever reasons, they went out of business. And their inventory of films went in different directions. Some sold to other companies. Some ended up in storage. And We the Living essentially went completely missing. And it stayed that way for some 30 years, roughly 30 years. And so flash forward to the late 1960s. Two people who were colleagues of Ayn Rand, Henry Mark Holzer and Erica Holzer, heard directly from Ayn Rand about the existence of this film. At that point, she was aware of it. She actually had seen one viewing of it in the late 40s. Rossano Brazzi and Alida Valli had come. She was living in LA at the time. And they came and they brought a film and they showed it to her. And she remembers really enjoying the film, except for some propaganda that was inserted in the film. And I'll go into a little more detail about that in a moment. So they couldn't believe it when she said there was a movie version of We the Living. Nobody really knew of the existence of it. And she said it's probably long gone. She hadn't heard anything about it in some 30 years. And they said, if we somehow could find the film, would you agree to have it released here in America? And she said, well, on a big condition. I did like the way the film was made, and I did like the performances of the main characters, but there were lines of propaganda dialogue that were inserted into the film, so contrary to her philosophy that it's incredible that they thought they could do something like that and make it work. She said that dialogue has to come out somehow. And the Holzer said, well, absolutely. If we find the film, if we can't remove that objectionable material, then it won't get released, but we'll make sure if we find it, that all of that happens. So they spent the better part of 2 years looking for the film, and this is, before the internet, easier ways to research things. They had to go to Italy several times and track people down, and it was like detective work. But eventually, they did locate the negatives in Rome, amazingly. They had been in storage, gathering dust. The owners really didn't even know the value of what they had, and the Holzers had to sort of be poker-faced about it, because in their minds, they had found the Holy Grail. Hank Holzer actually used those words to describe finally finding We the Living after all that time. It was the full negatives of the whole film. They were incredibly thrilled to find it. It was difficult to see the film because they were only prints of a few reels of it, and the rest of it was still in negative form. And Erika Holzer, who passed away a few years ago, often would tell this story about driving across Rome with these negatives, which back in those days, film negatives were made out of nitrate, which is a very flammable film material. It's not used anymore. But these were nitrate negatives. And she said, and then we found out later that they were bouncing around in the trunk of the car and thought that, they could explode. There are very rare instances of that kind of film exploding, but very rare. Usually the problem would be they would catch fire. But Erika just was so passionate about the film, and she loved telling that story about driving across Rome, and it got bigger and bigger every time she told the story. The last time I heard it, I think half of Rome was going to blow up. But they did wind through the negatives manually. They couldn't easily project it, but they saw that the whole story was there, and they bought the film on the spot. They bought all the materials with it. They had safety versions of the film materials made so that the fairly dangerous nitrate materials wouldn't have to be shipped back to America. And then all of this material was sent it was in storage like that, and it was sent to New York. And at this point, the project entered a whole new phase where the whole film had to be reviewed, decisions had to be made about, okay, what's this authorized version, this version authorized by Ayn Rand, going to look like? What's it going to entail, and how are these offensive propaganda dialogue, how is that going to be removed? And this is where I enter the picture. I saw this tiny little one-paragraph mention of the film in a publication called The Objectivist, a little green publication that came out for several years back then. And I did something very out of character. I wrote a letter to the Holzers. I didn't know them, and offered my services as an editor, even though I was only an assistant editor at the time. And then after sending it, thinking, well, this is, what did I do that for? I don't know anybody. I don't have a resume that would impress anybody. But amazingly enough, they did respond to me. I went in and had meetings. I started working on the film, ended up co-producing the film with them, and now I own the film, and I'm here at the Ayn Rand Institute presenting it. So it's amazing what one little letter can do. So one of the first things that happened is a viewing of the film, and for a lot of people, it would be their first viewing. And for Ayn Rand, it was only the second viewing, and it was like 25 years earlier that she'd seen it the first time. Now, this device is called a moviola, and everyone was gathered together. And when I say everyone, I mean the collective. If those of you not familiar with what that means, Ayn Rand had a very close inner circle that was, ironically, they named themselves the collective. And they were people that she associated with most of the time. And they were all gathered together to see this film. And you've got to picture the scene. Everyone's in folding chairs, gathered around this tiny little screen that's only about 5 inches diagonal. And the film is being run in reels of film, 10-minute reels, and it hasn't been edited yet, so it had a total of a 4-hour running time. And it was in Italian, and it wasn't subtitled yet. So 10 minutes at a time, new reels were loaded up on the moviola, and I think it was Erica Holzer would read from this script, which had side-by-side Italian with English translation, and would read the dialogue as we went through the entire 4 hours. And so what was everyone's reaction? My recollection is everybody was enthralled. And every time a reel changed, they couldn't wait for the next reel. And this went on for quite a few hours because of all the reel changes and the 4-hour running time. You could see even then, without the subtitles, without the editing, that it was just such a powerful, powerful film. So, at this point, you have Ayn Rand finally having input into this film that's so personal to her and so autobiographical. And it was her decision that the two films should be combined, that certain subplots were not necessary to the main storyline, that they could come out, but the main storyline between Kira, Leo, and Andre would stay totally intact. And then we worked on figuring out how do these propaganda lines come out. And I don't want to exaggerate how many propaganda lines there were. I would doubt that it's even 2% of all the dialogue. But it was just so offensive and so contrary to her philosophy that it was unquestioned that it had to come out. So after that initial screening, it was really just Ayn Rand and myself sitting side by side at a rewind table similar to this one in the picture, going back and forth in the film and figuring out what could be done and what scenes absolutely had to stay, and in some cases some scenes could go, and discussing propaganda. In some cases it was just a matter of changing the subtitles if it wasn't that objectionable. But she was very specific about what she wanted, and I was shocked at how much she had thought everything out ahead. There wasn't really me giving her a lot of advice, I can tell you that. She knew what she wanted. She understood the editing process, which amazed me because that was a time period where not many people understood film editing. And it all went extremely smoothly. She had her careful notes. We would meet in the evening when the studio was closed for the day in a little editing room and dim the lights and just start going through reel after reel and making the decisions. She had her notes about things that she specifically wanted to change. And I remember being extremely impressed with the sharpness and the focus that she had on what needed to be done. She was a very amiable and warm person to work with, which was great for me because I was just a kid and still very nervous. One of the most difficult scenes is near the end of the film when the character of Andre, standing in the center there, has to face a purge committee and explain his actions. And without giving away too much of the plot, he, has this quite awakening to what this philosophy that he's been supporting in the Soviet Union and what it really means. And that gets him into deep trouble, and he's in front of a purge committee. But that's where the fascist centers went a little bit crazy, inserting propaganda, and that had to go. And I will explain after the movie runs, if people are interested, some of the drastic steps we had to take to fix that scene. I'd rather not do it ahead of time so that you're not thinking about it during the movie, but happy to talk about it later. The good news is she was really pleased with the performances. And she had written many years earlier to her good friend how much she enjoyed the performances. And she felt assured that all the changes that she was asking for would be made, and they were. And then we're running short on time, so I'm going to go a little more quickly, but we entered into a period of getting better translation of the subtitles, finding nuances in the way they were translated. Say again, Anu? Okay, thank you. Thank you. So the film got completed. All the changes that Ayn Rand asked for were successfully completed. And the film, we went looking for distribution for it, and one of the ways you find distribution is to take it to film festivals. And the movie had its American premiere at the Telluride Film Festival in September of 1986. And that's a wonderful festival, by the way, if you ever have an opportunity to go to that. It's in this incredibly beautiful area of Colorado and quite prestigious. People come from all over in Hollywood, and a lot of celebrities go to it. And it was a thrill to have the movie open. This is the original poster when we first released the film. And this is myself and the Holsters celebrating the opening of the movie. It played in theaters around the country. I think about 60 to 70 theaters, generally, art house kind of movie theaters. Got incredibly good reviews everywhere. If you're interested in seeing them or learning other things about the movie, the website for the movie is wethelivingmovie.com. Make sure to put movie in there because there are other We the Living websites. There's excerpts from a lot of the reviews there. And then after a few years of distribution, and it did play in some other countries, basically it went into its afterlife as home video. VHS originally, and then DVD. But the problem was all the home video versions, in fact, even the theatrical release that was shown in theaters, all still had scratches and dirt and flaws and defects that the negatives had picked up from 1942 and onward, and they were just sort of baked into the film, and there was really nothing at that time that you could do about it. And so for 30-something years, the only version of the movie available is standard definition, so not real sharp, and full of scratches and dirt and so forth. And I felt that it was time to do something about that. And we initially started out just to make a high-definition version of the film. So we still had the film materials, and we had those scanned again in high definition. And my original plan was, well, great, it's going to be this really sharp, beautiful version of the film. But I was also aware that there was new software, new digital technology that could enable us to get rid of dirt and scratches. And so we started working on that. And the more I got into that, then I thought, well, we can also fix that. And then one thing led to another. It didn't start out as being, I'm going to restore the film, but it ended up that way. We're going to, in a moment, run a little video showing the before and after of mainly the high-definition part of it. And so go ahead and run that short video. You can see big differences in the shading on their faces and textures that just can't see in the standard definition. All the speckles and dirt are gone from the restored version. So that was how the work started, and then we got more and more into this wonderful digital software that was that could repair these problems. And I did a little sort of off-the-cuff video of working on that. It's a little bit long, so guys, I may ask you to cut it off at a certain point because it goes on for a while, but you can run that video. The original high-definition version of the video has quite a bit of dust and scratches. So we're using specialized software that's specifically designed to remove dust and scratches and improve graininess, excessive graininess that might be in the film. And the first thing it does is analyze each scene, actually each frame even, of the film to see what it's dealing with. We have a lot of control over how it does that analysis. We don't want to have it overdo it and change the look of the film. So it deals with that graininess first, and then the software analyzes and tries to figure out what is dust or scratch or dirt. It's able to determine what is a scratch and what is something that's intended to be left in the film. And it does a good job, an amazingly good job, actually, of figuring that out. And then it repairs the defects by cloning pixels that are next to the scratch and basically pasting them over the scratch so they disappear. And our goal is to really make the film look like it did when it was released in 1942. Here's the before, and here's after. It doesn't completely remove every spot and scratch, but it removes well over 90% of them. So this is before. You'll notice a big white scratch on the right and dozens and dozens of white speckles. And then again, after the treatment, it cleans it up quite beautifully. So that's before, and that's after. Okay, you can cut that off. It goes on a little bit too long. I just loved this when I was working on it. It was just like magic to see these things disappear, and you would get this feeling like, wow, I'm restoring the Mona Lisa or something. It was a great feeling. So we sort of backed into this very elaborate restoration. Every scene in the film was done and then redone and then done again because the software that would fix one thing didn't like software that would fix another thing, and we had to figure out how to make them all work together. It was a lot of trial and error. But in the end, it came out beautifully. You'll see that this evening. And even before we were completely done with the film, we mentioned it and we submitted it to a very prestigious film festival in Italy where they only run and honor restored films. It's a fabulous film festival. Every film that's shown is a classic, if not a masterpiece. And they're all beautifully restored. They saw a sample of the work we were doing, and we were invited to take the film to Il Cinema Ritrovato, which is in Bologna, Italy. It's an annual event. Boy, if you're looking for a great event to go to and you're a lover of films, you definitely want to go there all week long. They show these amazing films in venues all over Bologna, Italy, which is a beautiful city. And they show some of them in this giant plaza in the middle of Bologna on a giant screen to upwards of 6,000 people. And they do that every night for the duration of the festival. Wonderful people to work with. And all this just happened last week. We showed it there, and my wife and I jumped on a plane and came right here afterwards. It was quite an honor for them to select the film, and there's also a practical value in it, in that our next phase is approaching distributors to get the widest possible distribution for the film. And the best scenario is that you have multiple distributors who want the film competing with each other. That's not always an easy situation to create. And when a film is accepted this way, it sets the stage, it gives credibility. Distributors don't always have much of independent thinking about what makes a good film, and so to have an endorsement by a film festival is enormously valuable. So that's me with a translator who translated into Italian. The other thing about this film festival is all the movies have English subtitles, so it's just a joy to go to that festival. So next up for the film, we look for a great distributor to work with. And if we don't find a great distributor, we're going to distribute it ourselves. I've done that before. I've done it for years and years after the initial distributor distributed the theatrical version of the film. And for a variety of reasons, we weren't happy with what they were doing. And we self-distributed for quite a few years after that. But we still, for the widest distribution, we do want to make a great deal with a great distributor. That's going to be our next phase of the film. In addition to raising the money for a really, really good public relations campaign, because it's just tragic to have a beautiful film like the one you're going to see tonight, and people don't see it because they're not made aware of it. And that takes money. And so we're in the phase of raising money for that. We've already vetted or interviewed PR companies and some distributors. There's already interest. We're getting great reaction to it. And it couldn't be more important, this phase of it, because movies, and you probably all have heard this before, but there's really not a more powerful medium for conveying ideas. You have people sitting in the dark in the theater, their attention can only be focused on the screen, and they're being impacted by emotions and ideas and sound and music. It's incredibly powerful. And here you have Ayn Rand's wonderful We the Living story, very accessible to anybody, because it's before she developed the ideas so beautifully and spectacularly, really, in Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. There's really, I've experienced people who thought they hated Ayn Rand reacting just so positively to this film. And I think it's one of the most important ways we can get Ayn Rand's ideas out there through this vehicle of a movie that everybody loves to watch movies. And this is an Ayn Rand movie. So we're at that phase now. We're hoping that I mentioned heroes during the talk. We hope that some new heroes will step up and help us get this kind of support that's needed. Please feel free to come and talk to me. We have some cards that will give you some information that we'll have outside. You can always email us. We read all the emails that come in and respond if you think there's a way to help. And later when the movie comes out, if you all keep in mind to promote it on social media, that'll be enormously helpful. We're going to start the Q&A, but if you do stick around, just a final thought after the Q&A, but feel free to go to the microphones. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. This is fascinating. How many copies of the film survived World War II? Were you working with the Ferrara one that he sequestered or some other?
Well, to be not too technical about it, there are really no full prints of the film that survived that we are aware of. The negatives of the movie were what were hidden away and survived the war. And when the Holzers found those negatives, they made safety versions of that, and from that, the prints that went into theaters were made. So by the time we released the film, there were 7 or 8 prints of the film that circulated around the country.
Was the Ferrara one the one that the Holzers found?
Well, when you say the Ferrara one, yes, the one that Ferrara asked his colleague to hide in the basement, yeah, those negatives were what they found. Those actual negatives, which later went into storage and people lost track of them, Holzer tracked that down, identified them as We the Living, and bought them. The Scalera Films couldn't re-release the film after the war because they had never gotten the rights from Ayn Rand. They wanted to. And in fact, they sent Alida Valli and Rossano Brazzi to meet with Ayn Rand with a print of the film. And she loved the film, she loved the performances. But as you can imagine, she was not happy that this movie had been made without any participation on her part. She thought there was a possibility of Hollywood doing their own version of We the Living. And so it never came to fruition that she gave them rights. They couldn't do anything with the film, so they stored it away. And then all these years later, the Holzers found it. If it weren't for them, we would not be seeing this film. It's amazing.
We have a question from the online audience. It says, you mentioned that some work needed to be done on the subtitles. How different ideologically are the subtitles compared to the Italian audio in the final version?
Well, how different is a hard thing to quantify. Anybody who's involved with translation knows you can't just make a literal translation because different languages have different ways of expressing things. So you have to find the right phrasing that makes the most sense in a given language. So there are many cases where it is word for word a literal translation, but there are many cases where the true meaning of what's being said is better expressed colloquially in the way English is spoken. So it's a mixture of different approaches to get to the truest translation. We, all through the process, we kept referring to the novel, and whenever it was possible to take the language directly from the novel, that was done. So the titles had quite a bit of Ayn Rand's word-for-word dialogue in it wherever that was possible. Yes?
Who among the principal cast and crew, to your knowledge, read the novel? Alessandrini, any of the principal cast members?
Well, I don't have any direct knowledge, but I know it would be highly unusual for Alessandrini as the director to not have read the novel. But I'd be speculating beyond that. It's typical for lead actors to read the underlying novel, but not necessarily. Sometimes they'd rather just take it from the script and go with it that way. So unfortunately, I don't have any direct information about how many of them read the novel. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the information.
Sure.
Did the negatives include more than just the movie, outtakes, things that weren't used, or even the complete shooting film? And the second question I wanted to ask, is it possible, I was a film student, I'd love to do this, to see the original that was released so I could see what was changed and be fascinating to see that.
But the good news is it is possible to see the deleted scenes. In fact, on the standard definition release that we've had out for quite a few years, we do have the deleted scenes on there, but they're presented as deleted scenes. And that is at the request of Ayn Rand and a vow we made to Ayn Rand. She said specifically she never wants the film released in anything but the order that was worked out with editing the film. But that said, those scenes are not gone. They're there and can be viewed for historical or whatever purposes. We cannot release the film by integrating those scenes back into it. We wouldn't do that. She didn't want it, and we're not going to do it. But happily, you can see them anyway.
But there's no, the version that was released in 1942, there's no version to compare to see the full earlier release.
We don't have any version like that. I do occasionally hear about very, very poor copies that were made, copies of copies of copies in Italy. I saw one that was on a DVD. You think your eyeballs are going to fall out. It was so blurred and screwed up. I don't recommend it.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have another question from the online audience. It says, what kind of help is needed to get distribution for this film? Which is the most important way to help?
To be very direct about it, money. We're entering a very expensive part of the process, both the promotion and the distribution. This is where, if you know anything about how movies are released, this is where studios spend a ton of money. It's just the nature of the beast that it takes you to get people's attention. You'll notice when a movie comes out, it's constantly running in TV ads and so forth. We're not going to be doing any campaign like that. But this film could easily be overlooked if real money isn't spent on the promotion, the publicity, the distribution, and that's the phase we're entering into. We're trying to build up as big a budget as we can. We've had some wonderful support so far. Our executive producer, Lynn Florkowitz, several other people and organizations have really stepped up, but there's a long way to go. And we're really hoping if any of you can support this, we'd love to talk to you about it. You'd be doing a wonderful service because it would get this film in front of more people. It potentially can be seen by anyone in the world because it will be streaming. It'll be on a major streaming platform, as well as probably Blu-ray, DVD, and possibly other formats. We hope to also show it in a few select theaters, but mainly it's going to be watchable through streaming platforms. But yes, if there's any way you can support what we're doing, please come and talk to me, either here at the conference or get in touch with me at the email. And I really appreciate you all thinking of what you can do. Yes, go ahead.
Have you seen the Korean TV series Crash Landing into Love, which seems to have been made by a fan of Ayn Rand, and most of the allusions in it are to Atlas Shrugged, but there are also a few visual allusions to the We the Living film. Have you seen it? And if you have seen it, what do you think of it?
First time I'm hearing about it. So I'm sorry, I don't know. What's the name of this again?
Crash Landing into Love.
And where is it seen?
Okay, there are visual allusions. The longest of them is trying to escape North Korea in a smuggler's boat, very much like the sequence in the film.
Well, I'll definitely check it out. Anything that has those kind of allusions to We the Living. Hmm? It's on Netflix. Netflix, okay. I hear it's on Netflix. Thank you very much.
You talked about how big the impact was of the film on the Italian public viewers. Are you aware at all what the impact of the book itself was in 1937? Was it the date when it was published, or even how many copies roughly it sold?
I don't have exact figures on that, but I know it was big, and it did better in Italy than it did in the U.S., which is a surprising thing to learn. It did well enough that the filmmakers were encouraged to make a film out of it, but I don't have any specific figures on that. Yes?
Hi. First time I've ever heard We the Living, the movie, or any other version, so that was my first experience. Never read the book either. For the music, I thought that sounded very lovely. I was wondering, is there a catalog of the songs, or is there even a soundtrack? How could I get the music?
There's no available soundtrack, but if you Google Renzo Rossellini, he was the composer. If the name Rossellini sounds familiar, it's because his brother Roberto Rossellini was quite an illustrious director in Italy, and his niece Isabella Rossellini was an actress well known here in America for a while. But Renzo Rossellini composed the music, And you'll also notice tonight when you watch the film, there's just an enormous amount of Russian traditional music playing in the background in various scenes. They made really a maximum use of what, to me anyway, sounds like authentic Russian music. But the themes are beautiful. The soundtracks that we got were already mixed together with audio, with dialogue, I mean. And so, we would have to re-record the music in order to release a separate music soundtrack. We just don't have any separate version of it from Italy. But it's something to consider, having it re-recorded, because it is beautiful music. Thank you. Thank you very much.